Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Givanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Pau Garcia. Pau is the co-founder and lead of the studio Domestic Data Streamers. At his role at Domestic Data Streamers, Pau and his team have spent the last decade at the forefront of blending data with design and participative art, turning the abstract, numbers, spreadsheets, databases into tangible experiences. Their work has been in over 45 countries through a multitude of mediums: exhibitions, films, designs, robotics, web, and theater productions that transform public spaces, schools, prisons, and even the United Nations headquarters into interactive narratives. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Pau Garcia. He's the co-founder of Domestic Data Streamers, aka DDS. Pau, welcome.
Thank you, Pinar. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining. I know we had a warm-up conversation before together, and it was amazing. So I'm very excited about this episode and sharing our thoughts and conversation with the audience as well. And for them, if you can introduce yourself in more detail and share your background with us, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm Pau Garcia. I'm the founding partner of Domestic Data Streamers. I'm a graphic designer, but I studied graphic design afterwards. I did also master in media studies, which I still don't know what that means. But my focus so far have always been in the impact of information technology and art, right? And I have spent almost the last 10 years working with museums such as California Academy of Science or the Design Institute in Hong Kong, and big institutions like United Nations, UNICEF, World Food Program, and these kind of big agencies trying to figure out ways to make visible information, to show data in ways that could go beyond the classic infographics, going from theater plays, website, robotics, exhibitions, or all kinds of weird, odd installations.
And I guess beyond, and people will check out your website, and your work is so cool. And beyond the coolness of it and the art aspect of it too, why did you feel like that was important to do?
Mm, I I think that I felt a great disconnection between the way we perceive data and information and big numbers in general and what they mean, right? I remember in 2012, it was one of the biggest refugee crises in Europe. I guess you will remember there were like the coast of Turkey, also Greece, were filled up with refugees. More than 5 million people ran from Syria to this coast, and I saw that on television. I watched that every day, and this was nothing new for me. Like in Spain, we have seen people arrive to the coast of Spain for more than 3 decades now, and you always see that on television, and they somehow tell the data on that, like 200 people found dead in the Mediterranean Sea, and I could see my parents like keep going with the lunch, right? Eating without kind of getting any reaction to it. And I think somehow we have lived, we're living in a moment that the wall, because the huge globalization and the realities that we are living right now are so big, are so complex to explain, that they need to be explained with data. But at the same time, data is so abstract that somehow it doesn't make us feel anything, right? And I think this kind of disconnection triggered me to think about how, from a design discipline, we could do something different, how we could use cartographic systems and new ways to look to, or to design how we look at the world and how we analyze it. I think the main focus of Domestic is that we work to make visible not the data itself, but also the complexity that it hides, like all the emotional levels and all the obscure layers that are built in this data territory. And understanding that we are not in front of a map only, but we are also building a way of looking at it, right? And of course, the map have no sense without someone looking at them. So the context in which people looks at maps, look at visualizations, look at numbers are very important. And I think for a very long time, a lot of people have been pointing out that a big part of the humanization of both like different communities and countries themselves have been pointed out through classification and quantification, right? And I think numbers have this amazing way to show us the world. And I think the world cannot be understood without numbers, but the world cannot be understood with numbers alone. This is a quote from Hans Rosling, one of like the big names in the space of statistics. Um, and I truly think that the goal of domestic is to point in which ways we can go beyond numbers, right? And still understand which are the real meaning behind quantities and statistics.
I love that so much. I mean, I think it's a quite a chronic problem we see in many diverse like social issues, but also like environmental issues, right? Like numbers, it dehumanizes the conversation. Suddenly we replace like names, stories with just like a figure, and we get numb towards what we're like hearing. So your parents' reaction, I think that's such a strong insight in itself. And that's like a result of an observation, right? Like an ethnographer would actually like that would be part of the research, like observing that reaction to statistics. And there's power in that. And the power of that insight like led to DDS, right? So it's I think we sometimes what I see and especially like corporate or institutional space too, quantitative data has so much power in terms of prioritizing things, maybe I understanding urgency of like needs, but it's besides identifying what to focus on more or where we should do some work, it doesn't provide much insight nor like help identify action towards what we're seeing, right? So if you have numbers around refugees, what do you do with that? And I think what you do not only is like maybe the value of the qualitative research, like that stories, it comes to light, but it also comes to light in a multisensory experience, which is only very human. And that's why I love when we met, I like when I first looked at your website, I loved your work in terms of like how do we rehumanize almost some of these like conversations that are becoming just digits and more so and I think this also applies to when we talk about even numbers around issues around like our environment or climate change, right? What do we do with that number? What does that even mean? There's already like one thing that frustrates me. There's already like these like big words that are thrown out there a lot that we don't know what to do with them anymore, like innovation, collaboration, sustainability, whatever. And like you couple those with numbers, it's even more okay. What do we do with that? And I think creating a feeling should like is so much more powerful in instead of just like, you know, yes, like maybe the numbers and information like helps us raise awareness, but what do we do with that awareness? Maybe we do need to activate some feeling and connection to it. So with that, I'm really curious in how, and I know you may work with also like amazing organizations and art institutions. How does your work or how it might reflect into any corporate environment because all of us are active agents in all these issues in the world?
Yeah. Um, Going first back to something that you said, I think it is important to note that data is inherently reductionist, right? When we
Mm,
decide that something should be transformed into numbers, we are already taking out a lot of its essence, right? Um, I think that there is like so many ways to put it, but there was this Egyptian god called Tom that it said that the total is always more than the sum of its parts, right? And there is this old saying from Egyptian herders that say that when you count the sheep, you always have one less, right? And it somehow points out how um, when you count something, you lose the power of the whole in a way. It's not the same to say that there is Pau, myself, like the person, as to say there is one head, one torso, two arms, and two legs, right? This datification of individuals or communities somehow dehumanize them by defining them with certain things, and it creates like this relaxation on the descriptions or the definitions that somehow make us who we are, right? And as you say, it is a data is a kind of is very intertwined with power, corporate power, but also like technological power, political power, military power, right? I think one of the most interesting references on that was the first rebellion of Jews in Rome was over the census because they didn't want to be censored, right? They didn't want to be counted because counting something, it is somehow the first form of power because you understand it, right? You understand its parts, so you can actually act against that, right? So I think, and this is something that still happens today in Guatemala. Like a lot of families hide the teenagers in their families, so the militaries cannot go there to actually sense which are the boys in the age of going to the military, right?
Yeah.
This happens in certain parts of Guatemala, of course, but this is still like reinforcing this idea of counting means also exerting power over certain communities, right?
Yeah.
In terms of corporate environment, as you said, I think there has been a huge datification of the whole system, and it's very much connected to the space in which technology, information technology, has kind of become the truth, right? Have become like the main narrative. In order to justify anything, you have to be able to explain it in numbers. If it's not explainable in numbers, it's out of the market logic. And if it's out of the market logic, then maybe you should not be there on the board of a big corporation, right? That's 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 a bit how it works, or how I feel it works. And I think again in corporate spaces there is like this, it's always about the language that we use. I think we discussed that on our early coffee, that the language not only describes the wall but also constructs it, right? Whenever we say that there is a kind of very obvious semantic difference between saying that something is a property or something is a house or something is a home, right? It's the same difference that there exists between a product and a tool, right? And some of these languages embedded in this very mercantilistic, capitalistic mindset of buying and selling, right? And it's when you are talking about property or a product, you're obviously talking about something that people can buy and sell. Where whenever you talk about a home or a house or a tool, you're actually pointing out what it means to people, right? So these are like two sides of the same coin. I think it's in corporate environments, for example, banks, when they talk about and they use data, there is like this example that for me is very good. Yeah, a bank will always say that they have recovered 1,400 properties that were in default. They will never say that they have left 1,400 homes inhabited, right? And the data is the same, but the language that they use is totally different,
So
right?
true.
Pointing out that somehow it's within the data languages that we are exploring and the way we communicate information that we are hiding essential realities that are behind comprehensible figures, right? And I think these are the parts that are more interesting for me to understand which are the ways in which we sneak into language and the language of data, right? How numbers are very much connected to the words that surround the numbers, right? And corporate environments are very good at finding new terms
Yeah.
to define the same reality that we know, but from a different perspective that somehow tends to dehumanize, of course, because it's much easier to manage. I think I had like this crazy conversation with a man who was working as a flight control in a control tower in an airport. And I was talking about the work we do at Domestic. And he said, man, if I knew the amount of people that is in each of the planes that I have to control and land down, I will be so much stressed. So I prefer to humanize all this data. And I was like, yeah, of course, like there are situations in which you need to
Right,
dehumanize because you need to work in a very rational manner, and actually creating emphasis in the emotions behind that go against the true meaning and the
right.
functionality of using this data. But there are a lot of situations, most of them political, which you truly need to understand the contextual environment in which a figure or a statistic or a data set is presented, right?
Yeah, and it becomes a huge power of manipulation, right? Or AKA, what like in America they would call societal engineering. But yeah, I mean, I like when you were giving that example about like the planes, I was thinking a conversation I had with my dentist. He was like, "Yeah, it's just another mouth with like whatever issues for me. I'm not thinking about that person, like how are they doing that day? What are they going through? If I'm like digging through their mouth, and like, or for a surgeon, right? Like the compartmentalization of feelings and data actually becomes essential to operate. Whereas what we see in corporate or maybe political realm, it's more about power management and manipulation. And I love that you kind of brought that up. I think it's almost like an exercise for all the listeners today too, to like reframe how a data is presented, like a quantitative data is presented, right? So we often talk about data visualization or physicalization, but I personally I don't think enough on like data articulation. Like how would I rephrase this? Like how would I say this differently? I think it's just a good exercise to like go through your head whenever you're like presented with like a statistic or like a big number. Um, I'm very curious, and this is like, and I'm sure sometimes you feel this like frustration in your like work too. I feel like the sheer scale and the complexity of the things that we deal with, right? Like it has like that has become the reason and the excuse to quantify everything, right? Like even from like healthcare to education to every issue that we're facing, to be able to like manage it. Like I often go to acupuncture, and the way an acupuncturist would like read my pulse is like three different ways, right? Whereas like if you go like in Western practice, it's just a number. And the effort there is to standardize, have, I don't know, benchmarks maybe, and like include in studies. Also, just make sure you're like out the door in 10 minutes so you can accommodate for the next person, which again, like catering to a bigger population. So the scale of just humans. Um, and I feel like even though like the exponential growth in technology is also becoming a helpful tool for us, it is also in parallel kind of increasing the issues around the scale and complexity, right? Like it's all almost amplifying. As with this exponential growth, we might create our own set of like challenges or needs for like quantification because everything is like moving so fast and growing so fast. So how what I know like maybe you probably if you have an answer to this, I'll be amazed. But like, what are your thoughts on this? Whereas like, how do we practice like something like what DDS does, right, at scale? And you may not have an answer to this today, but like, how do you think we might get there?
Uh, I may not have an answer for that. I think, well, I think coming back to what you said, it's so easy to say this is the way, right? This is the way, and
Right.
this is the metric to count that. And I think right now, specifically in most of Western societies, we're living something through an extreme space of that, where we look at everything according to a single code, like a
Mhm.
universal law that governs most of the phenomena. There are two hemispheres, five continents, male and female, animal and vegetable, singular and plural, right, left, four
Yeah.
seasons, five senses, five vowels, 7 days, blah, blah, right? Unfortunately, the work doesn't work about this, right? And for example, this is something that I love. That is when I check like the classic natural sciences books from high schools, where you can still see classification of animals by the odd numbers of toes or their hollow horns, right? Like classifications that have no sense, but mainly in the 18th century it had sense, right?
Yeah.
And I think we are so I think as humans we are so scared, and the world is so huge that
Mm,
we need classification. It's a way of making sense of it, right? And it's very
mm,
functional. Like even prejudice is it's something that helps us, helps us in so many ways. And right now we are somehow fighting against some of these realities that have been imposed by society, by our culture, by tradition, religion, and so on, by our parents. Um, and I think it all comes to making certain questions, right? And I think
mm,
like this is at the basis of kind of the work that we do. That is, we actually don't show information. We frame a question, and then we kind of build like if they were kind of mushrooms, we build up like some information that can bring
mm,
the conversation towards certain ways, right? Towards certain spaces. But I think the most important part is how we become more uncertain and how we
mm,
learn to live with uncertainty upon certain things, right? Because I think it's such a brave uh, act to say, I don't know, right? And to live with that in a moment that everyone seems to know very well what the life should look like for other people, based on very few information, but nevertheless they know, right? And I think we need more people to be a bit more uncertain and be just okay, just trying to figure out which is the best way, be open to other perspective. And I think to create the spaces where these people thrive, we need to create the spaces where a lot of questions are displayed, right? So whenever we create an installation, an exhibition, a documentary, wherever, what we are thinking all the time is, if normally when we kind of design a piece of information, we are thinking as a, let's call it an artwork, a portrait that could be framed
mhm.
and held in a wall. And that's kind of a monologue. Like there is a portrait that is being shown to an audience, and people can receive that and have an opinion and so on. Whenever we are trying to build up um, an installation or a piece of information, we are always thinking in the metaphor of the fire, of the bonfire, of the campfire, right? So
Mm,
a campfire will always create something very odd. This happens everywhere in the world I have been. You can see people also always getting in a circle, which already is an interesting position to be around, always around the fire, and the kind of conversations that people have in front of a fire are totally different from the ones that they have in any other place. People get so intense, like really people start to talk about their shit, about like really deep important things, right? And it's a space where silence is not punished. Like you can actually stay there for a while and just look at the fire and so on. So whenever we are creating a piece of information, we are always trying to build this campfire, a place where people cannot just get an answer from it, but somehow build up like this conversation upon what is being shown.
yeah,
And I think like this is one of the most complex parts when designing information, that it's not
yeah.
only about giving an answer, but it's also about bringing up a conversation and a deeper question that we need to solve. And it's not about giving the solution, but opening the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, what are we solving anyway, right? I think like we like instead of like trying to answer a question like right away, just to there's so much value in just thinking deeper, maybe looking beyond the symptoms and like actually the underlying reasons of the symptoms we're seeing in the world. And if you can spark conversation around that, that can influence an entire generation, right? Like if there's just more exposure to it. Um, and I think, um, in Safi Bakal's like Loonshot's book, he talks about like even the most innovative person becomes the system in a system. So it's a very, and in systems intervention, it's so hard to like change systems in general. But the strongest way of doing that is changing mindsets, right? And I think what you do has the power of that. which is why you should be doing it everywhere. Whoever's listening to it should hire you guys to do stuff. But it's
This has become into
essential.
an advertising, into a info
Well,
commercial.
it's coming from me, so it's like ambassadorship. We'll call ambassadorship. Um, but it's essential, especially for people maybe who are just like going into work or education, right? To be exposed to these like discussions early on. Like there's so many things I reflect back upon where I'm like, oh my God, like compared to like this generation, especially when I'm looking at like Gen Alpha, I'm like sometimes like, oh my God, I grew up like a plant. I was so unaware of things. I didn't have the articulation of things like they do. And it's just the mindfulness they have, and I'm kind of like, wow, I became aware of so many things maybe post the age of 30. Like, I don't know, I'm still discovering, I know nothing. Um, and I think like having these conversations like early on is so essential, to just like also, not categorize things automatically because our brains just love, to your point, like categorizing and being familiar with like what we're seeing, right? Because we don't want that uncertainty. But just being comfortable in the discomfort of not knowing, I guess, and just
Mm.
like being open to ideate on an ongoing basis. And I love that you brought up uncertainty. I feel like that has even been like the theme of not the world, but like personally in my life too. Like that's a challenge I have. Like I'm trying to get comfortable with uncertainty. The more the world is becoming even like more uncertain every day. I came across a quote from Rachel Botsman the other day. I want to read it to you. I think like they're relevant to like what you said too. I don't know if you already read it, but it says, we often don't think about the connection between trust and uncertainty. We typically say
Mhm.
trust and risk, but basically the equation is the more you trust yourself, the more trust there is, the more you can tolerate uncertainty. The default is that most of us don't try to increase our tolerance for uncertainty. We try to minimize the risk. But that means that we're also minimizing the ability for us to grow and to trust. And I think this is obviously mentioned in like a personal level. But if the analogy to the corporations and the organizations we were like talking about is the same, right? It's about minimizing risk. Like how do we not take risk, and how can we be fail safe instead of like thinking of safe to fail experimentation maybe in what we're doing, right? So all of these call for like a paradigm shift, mindset shift, and it might take generations, but we need kind of experiences like what you're creating to be able to even like start that shift somehow. Um so that was like my big reflection to everything you were saying. I have like a very obvious question, maybe like the giant elephant and not in the room, the world. AI, with AI, data is even like data was always important. Now it's like the superpower. I don't know. It's like, or the villain and the hero. Um, what's AI doing to data? What's happening to data with AI?
Okay, I think they will start to punish podcasts that talk about AI because it's getting so populated, the Spotify about
We
this.
will not name this anything with AI. It will be like data art.
Exactly. Well, in any case, before going to AI, which is
Okay.
connected somehow, about uncertainty, I think there is a concept that for me was very relevant. That is the idea of mental models or world models,
Mm.
right? So there was this researcher called Van de Cruz who explained how we are somehow resistant to ideas that are outside of our mental models. A good example of this is, I don't know how many children are listening to this podcast, but this is a disclaimer for them. You should avoid the next 20 seconds. Um, for Father Christmas, right? When you are told that Father Christmas are the parents, right? Um, you somehow this destroys your mental model when you're a kid because you say, "Are you telling me that there is a global conspiracy between all the parents of the world to actually make this lie global, and then advertising on television, Coca-Cola is in it too, like you have all these brands buying into this huge like it have no sense, right? uh, and this has a lot to do with the way we somehow understand knowledge, right? And we have two
Mm.
ways of creating new knowledge or learning experiences. And one is the knowledge assimilation, right? That is when something that you learn, something fits perfectly into the model of the world that you have created. It's like if you had a house in your brain and somehow you bring new furniture that fits well with the room, right? But then you
Mm.
have something that is a bit more complex, that is knowledge accommodation, right? And knowledge accommodation, it's a defiance. You have to take something out of your house to actually put that furniture in, right? And this is very uncomfortable because you have to take out a part of you, a part of your identity, right? And then
Yeah.
put in a new thing. So it takes much more effort. And I think this is intrinsic in like we have to think about this whenever we are
Mm.
creating any kind of new way of learning experience or information device, because somehow we are in so many cases defying the mental models of people, right? And we have to be able to do that in a way that is not just polarizing people, because otherwise they
Yeah.
will close the doors of their house. They will say, no, I'm not interested in changing the furniture here, right? um,
Yeah.
so that, going back to the AI, I think artificial intelligence somehow is uh, mainly knowledge assimilation, right? So it only tells us right now things that fits into our mental models because the way we have to interact with it. And I
Mm.
think was this is one of the most challenging things about artificial intelligence, that it's so pleasant. Like whenever you talk
Yeah.
with GPT, there is a moment, even if you ask, can you put it in a more friendly tone? It starts to be too much friendly. It's cringe a bit. Like it's like, come on, don't be so friendly. Um, I don't want to confuse like you. I don't want to be your friend, right? Don't be so elegant and polite. Just be a machine. That is what you do. They are trying to, I don't, gaslight me with all this flamboyance and and good manners, right? So I think the conversation with artificial intelligence is a lot about language. What we were telling before,
Mm.
right? Intelligence, the use of the word intelligence is, I think, a terrible naming for artificial
Mm.
intelligence today. I think another name that I heard the other day that I liked much more is probabilistic machines or probabilistic algorithms. And for example, for image generation, these are probabilistic images, right? And I think, okay, that makes much more sense, right? When you understand that artificial intelligence is just the most probable answer, not the right one, just the most probable, then it takes out most of the, I don't know, like the fear, because
Yeah.
as we all know, like there is all this big narrative of fear. I was afraid when I saw GPT-2, which was the earlier version of ChatGPT. This was during the COVID 20 at in 2020. I was reading this article in GitHub of someone who had created like this whole script from a Rick and Morty episode,
Mm.
and they have trained GPT-2 with all the scripts of Rick and Morty. And then I said, this is impossible that they have generated a new script. A machine have generated a new script. So I go through all the paper and I went through the script and I was amazed and scared at the same point, right? So I started to study there, um, because I said, well, we have been working for so long in ways to represent information and databases, and now we have this new tool that apparently can manifest themselves, like can manifest databases into natural language, into the way we have like this conversation right now, which is the same way our ancestors were doing it 2000 years ago and 3000 years ago. So language is somehow our operating system, right? And I think that's very dangerous, of course, because it
Yeah.
tricks us into thinking that there is true intelligence on that, right? The language has always been a marker of intelligence. Dogs don't well, they can communicate in so many ways, but they can talk yet. We will see.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
GPT-5, maybe that changes,
Yeah.
but so far this has not changed. And I think another of the problems with language is that artificial intelligence is a space that it has been somehow taken on by engineers and by the
Mm.
engineering language, right? And because AI it's shown as a complex software, which it is, um, the you can see it everywhere. IT departments are often put in charge of corporate AI strategy, which is terrible. Computer scientists are assumed to be experts on forecasting for the social change of AI, right? And and many people, that I think this is the most terrible part, many people seem reluctant to use artificial intelligence or to talk about it because they don't know computer stuff, right? This is like saying that, I know, because to talk about humans, we have always to talk about people that know how biochemical systems work, right? It's like uh, you
Yeah,
cannot paint if you know the molecular makeup of pigments, right? These have no sense. Like we have to be,
that's
I think,
so true.
to push for other disciplines to talk about artificial intelligence and to take a stand and a political position and an ethical position and a disciplinary position on the use of artificial intelligence, because for me it's clear it's kind of revolutionary in so many ways, much less than a lot of the marketing that these big tech companies are doing, but it's
Yeah,
nevertheless technologies that is changing a lot of things.
yeah. But it's such a, in itself, it's such a good case example of everything we discuss in terms of like how language has power and even how we name it, right? The fact that you put an intelligence in there creates this like fascination and fear at the same time, which you don't even know what to do about it. And mean, instead of like going into a constructive mindset where you could explore, okay, this is actually a really useful tool. Like, how do I use this in my space, right? And then going back to kind of like maybe thinking a little bit more and having time to think a little bit more, everything we should be spending more time on, right? Like all the critical things, and to have space for maybe like reframing instead of like thinking of like this is going to replace me, or just being fearful for your like job, right? Like how do I, and I love, kind of like the naming aspect, like we should just call it probabilistic algorithms, and like, or like something tool, right? To like just and I feel like as, and this is maybe because also like to your point, because it's like engineering led, it's like the engineering, like the language is dominated by like engineering culture, and it's making it hard to be perceived or adopted or immediately embraced by like other departments, right? Like if it was like a much more like human accessible language around everything, and we kind of like understand applications right away and use cases right away, I feel like we could go into more like a critical thinking mindset rather than just like a fear mindset. And I think it was you who told me like people champion innovation but hate change. Like, and of course, like this is also a great example of that, right? Like it, we will change, but like if we don't, that's the problem, right? Like I'm watching Life on Planet Earth on Netflix these days. Like the world has changed so many times. Like so many species got wiped out, came back. The climate has changed multiple times. Everything just has changed. And in that, when looking at that, nothing has changed. And this is like a different way of kind of like evolution happening with us too, like with technology involved. But the challenge is not like AI or probabilistic algorithms itself. It's really like how we look at it, how we address our systems, how we look at leadership. I mean, the best AI, like head of AI strategy I've ever met is a person who has 10 years, he's like a journalist. He has 10 years in journalism. And he's the best AI strategist I've ever met, right? Like going back to your point in terms of like who should be like leading these like conversations. Um, and I think there's I do hope, in an optimistic way, it becomes a means for us to kind of rethink or relook at ourselves, like do a self-check almost, right? Like where do we stand as humans? Um, what can we do if we're going to have these like super tools that can help us, um, instead of just create it's just like being too tech centric in the sense that what's the next hype, like what are we doing next, without like thinking of anything, just like on to the next, or also without being like jobs, like just like fear. I think there are like two camps, right? And then there's like people in the spectrum. There's like the Star Wars clan. They're like, oh yeah, like we're on to the next, like this is Matrix. And then we have kind of like, oh, this is the end of all, and then there's the in between, and there are like ethics and responsibility people who are kind of
Yeah,
like more closer to this is the end of all, which is not helping the conversation. Like we need more bipartisan representation in this
that
space.
is true. I think it is too late to be pessimistic. So we truly need people to construct spaces, well, to come with constructive solutions, right? And
Yeah.
I think it's okay to acknowledge that there are interests that go like beyond what we can do to change them at certain places. I don't know where I read it, but I think it was for me a beautiful idea, well, terrifying at the same time, but I think an idea to engage nevertheless, that say that the battle of tech, it was moving from a battle of attention from Instagram, Meta, and all this to a
Mm,
battle of intimacy, right? So as
yeah.
artificial intelligence can now feel close, can simulate emotions, is using our own language, no?
Yeah.
Intimacy switches our firewalls and makes us shift our perspectives, so like that's the next generation of big tech focus, right? Going
Yeah.
into intimacy. And I think understanding that, for me, it's of course scary, but it also points out what is the true, like that the true meaning of artificial intelligence, it should not be the tool itself, but the power
Mm.
it have in the narratives that it builds, right? And how, and this has to open, I think, like the bigger conversation, how we can defend ourselves of certain narratives, how we can protect ourselves, and how we can be encourage a more critical spirit towards the way these new ways of hacking our perception of the world, our perception of reality, in the same way that we discovered that if we, instead of spending 8 hours a day connected to our phones, we could spend more time
Everything.
with our family, and that will actually improve our relationships, which actually is not a great disruption into the kind of knowledge that on family union, but nevertheless now it has been demonstrated, right? So I think
Yeah.
is yeah, I think these are all ideas, I think, that should not be ignored with an
Mm.
optimistic idea of what we could do, but they should be acknowledged. And then, so what? What do we do now,
Right.
right? How we can build systems to protect us, but also systems to enhance our capacity to feel, our capacity to empathize, to our capacity to be more critical with ourselves, right?
Mm.
One of the most beautiful spaces that we are exploring right now is what we call adversarial AIs. So these are systems that whatever you do, they will criticize you, right?
Yeah.
And they will come after you and say, hey, this could be better in this way, in this way, and this way. And you are not taking
Yeah.
into account this, and this, right? So instead of asking artificial intelligence to make your work, you're asking AI to
Mm.
look up for, I don't know, red lines, for potential risk, for spaces in which your own ideas could be improved, and spaces in which maybe you don't have enough knowledge, or you don't have the capacity to place yourself in the shoes of another person. And now you can have like this agent that is somehow working for you to actually place the voice of someone else in this conversation, right? So
Yeah.
there are a lot of possibilities of good uses of artificial intelligence. It sometimes can feel a bit, if you look at the marketing advertising of some of these companies, it feels a bit like there is a lack of imagination, and it's all focused on
Oh
control
yeah.
and automatization, right?
Yeah.
But
Well, we've
there
seen that
is,
many, many years through capitalism. I think it's like another version of like that, but with AI.
I think it was Paul Virilio who said, inventing the Titanic is to invent the sinking of the Titanic, right?
Mm.
And I love it. I think he put it in a very beautiful way to say that it was, whenever we invent technology, of course we are inventing like the consequences of it, right?
Yeah.
And somehow the only thing that, or the things that we can do, is to put like some guardrails and to understand which are the limitations, and to understand in which spaces we could do experiments, and before escalating up to like this global arena, right? That we have right now.
Yeah. I love that. I think you're already kind of hinting towards like what we should be mindful of, like the future with like AI and advice around that. And I recently watched AlphaGo, and it was interesting because it actually like when it takes place is 2016, right? So it's like it feels like ancient times compared to where we are now. But what was so fascinating to me is this person who is 18 times global champion. Um, sees this as such a learning experience, right? Because he has never been challenged in the way that AlphaGo has challenged him before. He felt like he grew. And he believes he's going to be a better player because of it. And I think what you said in terms of like, how do we be better versions of ourselves, right? Whether we're like looking, whether it's like investing time in relationships to being critical of ourselves, but also looking at like personal growth opportunities by having these tools or agents, I think is the mindset to be in, so that we're also, approaching AI not with the mindset of like a threat, but more how do we prepare, right? Because we can't plan. There's no planning for what has to come, but how do we prepare? How do we think of like the future in different ways? So it kind of removes us from this like crisis, like alert mindset to more like deeper thinking mindset. And I do want to be mindful of our time. I think we can like have a conversation all day, probably around the campfire. And the conversation would go into many different ways if we do that. But given the like the volatility, uncertainty of the world today, uh, everything around data and everything around like technology, what would be your advice to people who are just like, interested in making some positive shift, dent, change in this world?
I think now we are in a moment of a wonderful opportunity that it has not happened since the beginning of the internet, which
Mm,
is that the artificial intelligence that students are using today in their universities are the same models that the most advanced high-tech corporations are using in their laboratories. So I think this big disruption has created a epic equalization of tools,
mm.
right? And I think that every human organization, institution are somehow lost in the same way. And this is a beautiful opportunity to rebalance certain spaces of power. So my advice for young students and people working right now in these spaces or exploring some of these tools is that find cracks in the system and put all your efforts in them to make that crack your discipline, because there are a lot of spaces which no one understands, no one knows, and now is a great opportunity to do it. Is as the beginning of the internet, when no one knew what a website meant, right? It was a
Yeah.
personal space, it was a what, it was a chat, it was a what was the internet, right? We are going through this very awkward situation with the technology, like we still don't know how to interact with it. But I think at the same time is a beautiful opportunity to define how we will interact with it, right? And I think creative disciplines have a lot to say on that. And you don't need to be a designer. You can be a writer. You can be a philosopher. You can be whatever, like a photographer. But there is now the opportunity to redesign and redefine a lot of the disciplines from this equalization, where there are like the biggest experts on artificial intelligence and NLPs are like no more than 5 years experts on that, right? So there are no
Yeah.
like people with a career of 60 years behind them. Of course, artificial intelligence is a big discipline, but generative artificial intelligence is something very new. So yeah, that will be my advice. Just go for it, find the crack, make it big.
That's so awesome. That's so empowering. And I'm sure it will resonate with a lot of, like as an educator too, I can see it can resonate with many of my students. Pal, this was amazing. I really can talk to you all day, but we need to wrap up. Any last thing you would like to mention about DDS? Anything we should follow?
We will be opening a crazy new project in Barcelona. Hopefully, it will be touring to different cities called Synthetic Memories. If someone is interested, visit syntheticmemories.net and you will explore a bit more about how we're using generative AI in social setups.
It's a
And that
brilliant
is this
project.
week's
I saw
episode
it
of What's
and
Wrong
I
with the
was like, I need to
podcast.
interview
To make
Pau.
sure you
So
never miss
check
an
it out. And
episode,
it's a good
subscribe
excuse
to
for
our
everybody to
show
go to
on Apple
Barcelona.
Podcasts, Spotify, or any other
Sure.
podcasting platform.
Thank you so much,
You can
Pau.
also
This is such a
subscribe to our
treat.
YouTube channel.
Thank you,
Links
Pina.
can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.